briefly, Commissioner Simington, this is our 15th anniversary year in June, so we've got a few more months until it's official. This is not the time to recount stories about those 15 years. I'll just say it's been terrific, and we're grateful for the friends and that we have and the supporters we have, and for the impact that we've been able to have. And then I'll also just mention briefly that it's the 14th anniversary year for our annual conference. As many of our attendees know, and we have many regular attendees, we do that in March generally each year at the National Press Club. Of course, this year will be different. Will actually be the first year we haven't been in the press club in, I think, 12 years for that event. But I think we're going to do that. It will be virtual, of course, and I think we'll do it over a week in March. I think March 22nd through 2026, I believe it is. And so I'm just giving you fair warning right now that I'm going to hopefully have you back to speak in one way or another at that annual conference. So I'm sure there'll be even more to say then. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let's officially begin today's event. And I'm delighted to welcome Commissioner Simington and our attendees to a special Free State Foundation event. It's special because this is Commissioner Simington's maiden address as an FCC commissioner. So in just a moment, I'm going to give him a proper introduction, but I do want to say that I'm proud that we've actually been fortunate to host other FCC commissioners to deliver their maiden addresses. And one that especially comes to mind is Meredith Baker. She gave her maiden address September 9th, 2009, over at the Press Club at an FSF event. But what made her address memorable, and aside from the content, of course, was that she flew back from South America overnight. I think it was Brazil, in order to make it to the Press Club, and she arrived just in the nick of time. I think I was stalling a bit until she could arrive, as I had to stall a bit this morning. And but Meredith arrived and delivered her address, so that always sticks in my mind, and I'm sure this event always will as well, because it's, of course, not only your maiden address, but the first virtual maiden address that we've had. So now I'm going to introduce Commissioner Simington. Many of the regulars know that often when we've had our speakers who have spoken previously and have been with us many times, I shortcut the introductions and say, go to the website and read the bio. But in this case, I'm going to give Commissioner Simington a bit more of a full introduction. Commissioner Simington is, I think almost everyone knows, was nominated by President Trump, confirmed by the Senate, and sworn in as a FCC commissioner on December the 14th, 2020. And all of that happened rather quickly, as these things sometimes go here in Washington. Commissioner Simington brings both public sector and private sector experience to the commission, which, to my way of thinking, as an aside, is beneficial. We haven't always had that. We don't always have to have it, of course, in commissioners, but it's been my experience observing the commission over a long period of time that private sector experience can bring a perspective to the commission's work that's useful, and Commissioner Simington has that. Before coming to the FCC, he served as a senior advisor at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. In this role, he worked on many different aspects of communications policy, including spectrum, broadband access, and the U.S. government's role in the internet, all matters, of course, that remain important and will be important during his tenure as FCC commissioner. Prior to joining NTIA, he was a senior counsel to Brightstar Corporation, an international mobile services company, and in that capacity, he negotiated telecommunications equipment and service transactions with leading providers in over 20 countries. And of course, that relates directly to the private sector experience that I was referring to earlier. He also practiced law in private practice as well. Commissioner Simington's a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. He also holds degrees from the University of Rochester and Lawrence University. He grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm not certain, but I don't recall another commissioner who was a native Canadian. He became a U.S. citizen, of course, and he now lives in Virginia with his wife and 3 children. Now, before turning it over to Commissioner Simington, our tweet, our hashtag this morning, and of course we invite you to tweet, is hashtag FSF Simington. And after Commissioner Simington's address, I think we may have time for a few questions, and you'll be able to use the chat function to put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to a few of those. So with that, Commissioner Simington, we're delighted to have you here. We're honored that you're giving your maiden address at the Free State Foundation. And with that, and I'm glad that we're able to actually see you now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Commissioner Simington.
Well, thank you very much, Randy, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here virtually at the Free State Foundation for my maiden speech. As part of its work promoting free market limited government principles, the Free State Foundation has a long and thoughtful record on telecommunications issues. And so it's an honor for me to take this stage where many of my distinguished colleagues have spoken before. This month marks the 25th anniversary of the Telecom Act of 1996. This landmark bipartisan legislation would be a great model for consensus on telecom legislation going forward. It led to a stable, sustainable, broad-based consensus that has supported growth and the common good for a quarter century of rapid change. It's worth taking a moment then to reflect on how much of our modern regime of telecommunications governance is owed to the principles and to specific advocacy efforts of the Free State Foundation and other such groups over the past 15 years. Today, the Hushaphone and Carterphone lawsuits seem impossibly quaint and exotic, like the penny farthing, patent medicines, or the handlebar mustache, though that last one may be mounting a modest comeback. This tells us how far we've come then from the restrictive regulatory environment of the post-war era. Things were moving in a better direction by 1995, but even so, spectrum auctions were in their infancy, the baby bells couldn't even offer long-distance service, and innovation was frequently stifled by lawfare. While the present day may not be perfect, I don't think anyone disputes that we have fulfilled the promise of the deregulatory era. Prior to the Telecom Act, it was far from a foregone conclusion that we would graduate to a more efficient competitive system. A change in national direction could have sent us back to the incumbent-driven system of mid-century. Instead, we came together, chose the free market and a light regulatory touch, and a quarter century of transformative innovation speaks to the wisdom of this choice. The past decade has seen an incredible convergence of communications technologies that would have been impossible to predict in 1996. By then, the distinctions between telephones, television, and newspapers that seemed so obvious and fundamental in 1934 were already growing creaky. Today, They are in the rearview mirror and receding fast. Your phone might well be a wireless device connected to home Wi-Fi through which you access fiber internet and on which you watch television and read the news. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, he told the audience that that day they would see three new products: a phone, a revolutionary internet device, and a new iPod. Then he revealed that it was a single product combining all three. That's as good a summary of the smartphone era as any. And yet, this mundane daily activity is a smooth surface over a convoluted legal infrastructure. Reading the news at the breakfast table is an act that combines licensed and unlicensed regimes, Titles 1, 2, and 3 of the Communications Act, content that may be international or multinational, and that's all before you've had your morning coffee. Under these circumstances, the FCC has to discern what the public convenience, interest, or necessity requires, based on a regulatory history that in many cases was only loosely directed by Congress. The Telecom Act took careful account of technological convergence and legal balkanization. But in 1996, it would have been impossible to predict how much the former would accelerate, even as the latter survived in nooks and crannies. Further, it's quite reasonable to argue that excessive efforts to anticipate the future would have been disruptive and resulted in overreach. So I don't intend to criticize the Telecom Act in any respect for the curiously converged situation we find ourselves in today. At the time, it was a major, forethoughtful, and sorely needed set of reforms, and it set the stage for vast advances. Instead, in the spirit of the Telecom Act itself, I would encourage Congress to revisit the question of refreshing telecommunications law. I believe Congress has kept to a clear and sensible course in the past 25 years of telecom law. It has sought to lower technological barriers to convergence. It has sought to protect regulated firms from unregulated ones so that convergence doesn't put incumbents in regulated industries at structural disadvantages. It has reserved the right to push for pro-social outcomes overall, even as it has declined to pick winners. But it's probably coming time to have a fresh look at the situation. Video, for example, faces very different treatment depending on the sourcing entity and the physical means of delivery. Telephony takes place seamlessly between copper wires and apps. Like today's computerized cars, the very simplicity and ease of use of customer-facing interfaces has made it easy for us to ignore how complicated things have gotten under the hood. And this has manifested into public discourse in unanticipated ways. A public raised on certain standards of speech and platform access feels occasionally betrayed and bewildered by the new role of online companies in the dissemination of speech, even as such companies try hard to be responsible to both the free speech and speech accountability constituencies, and even as they are burdened by unclear or contradictory legal and regulatory guidance. Today, there's a debate about fact-checking on voice chat applications, but we'd hardly be happy if people proposed to fact-check our phone calls. Convergence has left everyone in a state of uncertainty. What is permissible, what will be recorded, who decides, and where to turn. And it's tough to tell the public that the transmission medium is the basis for what they can say, even if that's the legally correct answer. Most of the issues that I'm raising here are the kinds of issues that we would want decided by Congress, not the FCC, as a matter of democratic accountability and legitimacy. They are also issues whose technical details are bracing for professional telecom attorneys and experts, and as such, utterly opaque to the general public. Congress may well decide that for some of these issues, regulatory competency resides more properly with agencies other than the FCC, such as the FTC. I recognize that what I'm calling for today won't be easy, but as we've seen this past year, we're facing a major social fault line and flashpoint. We can't let the history of telecommunications law be what holds us back from a resolution. We can't talk meaningfully about freedom, free markets, or deregulation in telecommunications without mentioning net neutrality. In my confirmation hearing, I said that I believed in a light touch regulatory regime. Title II net neutrality can have a light or a heavy touch. As it is likely to be back on the agenda this year, I think we need to get serious about what different approaches may mean. Two of the leading theoretical motivations are the monopoly argument and the gatekeeper argument, so let's review those for a moment. The monopoly argument is that many Americans don't have meaningful choices among broadband providers. Thus, in the absence of a regulatory regime preventing it, monopolist providers will take advantage of their market power to favor themselves. This needn't mean price gouging as such. It might mean cutting deals with content providers, for example, for preferential treatment or exclusion of their competitors. The gatekeeper argument is less about physical media. It says that an internet intermediary shouldn't be able to leverage its position to block, throttle, or favor content, regardless of whether a local transmission monopoly exists for any given customer. because companies who reach consumers via ISPs must have access to all consumers all the time and vice versa. I'd also like to mention one additional argument. I'd characterize the minimum standards argument as the argument that commercial ISPs need to face rigorous minimum standards with defined legal accountability for resiliency and reliability. These standards are said to be justified because of consumers' reliance on ISPs. We wouldn't accept poor reliability or resiliency from utility companies, so we shouldn't accept them here either. This is more of an argument for Title II than for net neutrality per se, but with Title II on the agenda, we have to think about this argument as well. Without denigrating the real concerns of those raising the monopoly argument, I think we can agree that it grows less applicable with every year. Not just new providers, but new technologies and means of transmission are rapidly entering the market. They are doing so because America's appetite for connectivity currently creates an attractive investment environment for adding capacity. Many of us use multiple broadband technologies and providers every day, and not many of us are worried that our ISPs are going to censor our communications. The gatekeeper argument, on the other hand, has implications far beyond the ISP level. Internet intermediaries could be taken to mean a lot of companies that aren't ISPs. Carving it out to mean only ISPs seems more and more dubious as ISPs become a more commoditized part of the consumer online experience. For many of us, search engines, app stores, e-commerce sites, and social media accounts are more fundamental components of our online activity than whichever ISP we may happen to subscribe to from time to time. I've had one particular e-commerce account since 1999, and I've used it for at least 10 different addresses. And yet, it seems facially absurd to require that they abstain from restricting others' content, whether we're talking about e-commerce or social media or app stores. What's the point of building a commercial service if you have to open it to exploitation by non-contributors? The minimum standards argument is hard to argue with. Presumably, we're all in favor of high standards for services. I'll note only that sometimes these standards may come with unacceptably high costs and lock-in effects if imposed by a Title II, but otherwise I'd like to pass over this point for the moment. None of this is to say that any of these arguments are bad, that they won't prevail in court or in public opinion, or that existing telecommunications law is free of some strange legal fictions. Even the Supreme Court has noted that sometimes deferring to the evident will of Congress and the FCC trumps a strict extrapolation of a stated rationale to its logical conclusion. It's merely to say that none of these arguments are above criticism either, and we have to think carefully about the effects of imposing them. On the one hand, after Verizon v. FCC, Title I net neutrality seems like a dead letter. This leads proponents of net neutrality to Title II. But on the other hand, Title II net neutrality, whether under any of the theories I've discussed or some other, may have many seriously harmful unintended consequences. As Randy noted, I come from the world of corporate and project finance, and that's where I see some of the worst consequences are potentially arising if we aren't very thoughtful about what kind of Title II we get. Every corporate initiative has to compete for capital internally. If a project can't make an adequate risk-adjusted return, it won't get funded. Full telephone-style Title II net neutrality might not kill the share prices of ISPs, but it will make their infrastructure return profiles worse than they would be otherwise. This can't help but chill infrastructure construction, maintenance, and modernization. Thus, my biggest worry about Title II is really that after a few years of a chilling effect on infrastructure construction, we will find ourselves in an entirely avoidable and artificial broadband infrastructure crisis. This isn't just about pressure on lines to homes, but on the wired infrastructure implied by the use of most wireless technologies. America's hunger for wireless bandwidth has gone parabolic in the last 10 years. Wireless Wi-Fi depends on predominantly wired connections. Wired infrastructure is more needed than ever, and major players in the wired infrastructure industry are now setting minimum bandwidth and latency standards that would have seemed absurdly high just a few years ago. And if we experience a chill to construction incentives at the very moment that demand is dramatically escalating, I worry that free market solutions will seem impossible, not because the corporate sector is incapable or greedy, but because they've been put in a regulatory bind. This will generate calls for a government-led solution, because the problem of capacity will be a genuine problem, even if it is rooted in regulatory choices. Indeed, a government-led solution may even be the best solution once we find ourselves at that point. I'd prefer to avoid a government-led solution by not precipitating the problem in the first place. This isn't from some sort of general principles aversion to government activity, but from concern about the state becoming the infrastructure financier of first resort. If there is no economically viable way to build broadband infrastructure without state involvement, the state will definitely have to get involved. And at that point, we will have permanently politicized broadband infrastructure as an economic sector. This should concern everyone who believes that debt finance should be the ordinary course finance model for infrastructure. The state can and should have a role to play in regulating industries, supervising industries, providing subsidies when socially necessary infrastructure is not economically viable, and correcting market failures. Politicizing a major industrial sector is quite another matter. Without internalizing the expertise and oversight of all the commercial banks funding infrastructure nationwide, it's hard to see how the state could do this job adequately or even as well as the current market. And at that point, we're talking about socializing far more of the economy than the innocent words Title II facially imply, and more than many Title II supporters would condone. And frankly, if we're going to have an industrial policy, I could think of sectors that need it more. But I don't think we need to go down this road. I hope Title II advocates, currently politically in the ascendant, will work with those of us who have concerns in the Mertonian spirit of disinterested collegial common pursuit of sound public policy, unbeholden to any slogan or faction. And I pledge to talk to anyone who wants to talk about this, to bring a respectful, open mind to the conversation, and to do my best to understand everyone's concerns, because mutual trust and confidence is the basis of progress here as anywhere. Thanks very much.
Commissioner Simington, thank you very much. There is a lot there to think about, and I appreciate the substance, really, of your remarks. I'm just a couple quick reactions that I have, but in the meantime, I want to tell the attendees that they're free to put questions in the chat function, and we'll try to get to a couple of those if you would like. You know, a couple things struck me from listening to your remarks right off the bat, aside from the real substantive pros and cons of the things you talked about when you were talking about the Telecom Act and Congress taking another look at it. I liked the way you spoke about refreshing the act. You know, for a long time, there have been advocates, Commissioner Simington, of having Congress update the act, modernize the act, replace the act, and so forth. But I haven't heard anyone yet speak about refreshing it, and that was a refreshing way to think about it. That maybe is a little more appealing to some people that otherwise might not like those other terms. So I thought that struck me. You know, when you were talking about net neutrality and Title II, without now getting into you know, the substance of those arguments, which I think we may have to potentially get into soon enough. I will say that I really appreciate it as someone who's been involved in the net neutrality arguments for since 2005. I would say maybe 2004. That the way that you spoke about the financial aspects of funding broadband, I think that really bears serious thought. And you know, I think at one point you talked about not wanting to see the government become the infrastructure financier of first resort, or something to that effect. And I thought that your insights really, again, stemming from some of the experience you've had in the private sector regarding financing of these projects and how that's impacted by the regulatory environment, were important for us to consider as we go forward. So I want to just ask you a few questions that really at least now, don't relate to the difficult issues that you face as a commissioner, but I think people would be interested in knowing about these. First of all, have you had a chance to visit the new FCC building and your new office yet? I'm not sure what's happening in that regard.
Thanks very much, Randy. First of all, appreciate your comments, and then as to the specific question, yes, I've had the good fortune of going to the FCC building a number of times. I actually broadcast. I perhaps should have made more a point of it, but I broadcast the last public meeting in January from my office in the building. Uh, Chairman Pai, well, I have to get used to saying former Chairman Pai. I'm not there yet. Former Chairman Pai, and of course, was very protective of agency staff and initiated a telework order that is still in effect and was preserved and was retained completely intact by Acting Chairwoman Rosenworcel. So FCC staff is, as a general matter, not in the building unless there's a pressing reason for them to be there. However, I'm not bound by that order, and I've taken advantage of it to make some use of the facilities. All I can say is it's extremely nice, and I'm looking forward to hosting many of the participants on this call, not least because once I'm able to host people in the building, that will mean things are back to normal.
For sure. I think everyone on the call will agree with that sentiment. You know, when I first visited the FCC, I think it was 1977. And the commission's headquarters, well, its only building in DC was at 19th and M Street at that point. And the commissioners were located on the 8th floor. And of course, when the commission moved to the portals, the commissioners' offices were located on the 8th floor. So, you know, at least for the last 50 years or so, whenever visitors wanted to visit with the commission, they would just speak of the 8th floor. You know, I'm going to the 8th floor. And, you know, that was like to tell people that you were, you know, thought you had important business and you were meeting with important people, of course. What floor, uh, what floor are the commissioners going to be located on in the new building?
Well, Randy, you heard me mention legal fictions. I think the social fiction of the 8th floor is going to persist for some time. Unfortunately, I understand that at the portals there was a little bit of a fudge factor to get the 8th floor designated the 8th floor. This was not repeated at the new building, so it'll be the 10th floor.
Okay, well, we'll have to get used to that. I assume it may, for old timers, perhaps like myself, it may take a while, but that's the reality of it. Commissioner Simington, can you tell us what I know when you become a commissioner and even before you're sworn in, you get a lot of advice, a lot of it probably unsolicited and but also advice perhaps that you solicit. What is the best piece of advice, or if you can't single out one, maybe a couple pieces of advice that you received from former FCC commissioners regarding your new position, or if not former FCC commissioners, from anyone?
Well, again, that's a great question, Randy. And I'll just preface this by saying that I've made a point of speaking to many former commissioners and chairs, um, precisely because the FCC has such a storied history, and because commissioners normally form a very discrete and limited part of that. 9 years, for example, would be a very long time for someone to stay on the commission. But there are many experts within the building at the staff level who have been there 30 years or more. So maintaining institutional continuity on the so-called 8th floor, it's something you have to actively do. As to a good piece of advice, I received an excellent piece of advice just a few days into the job when I took a call on my cell phone, and when it cut out, I thoughtlessly complained, "Oh, this is such rotten cell phone service." And the person on the other end of the line said, "Whatever you do, don't tell me who your carrier is, because if you say you've got a problem with your router or your cell service or something like that, and it gets picked up in the press, then it can move markets." Now, I'd like to reiterate that there are cold spots for everyone's cell phone service. Everyone has problems from time to time with any kind of a service, and I certainly would not signal out any kind of any enterprise or anything in any kind of public statement exactly for that reason. And I think the larger point, though, for me to take away from it was the gravity of the responsibilities that come with the job, and the way that a public-facing role like this in the policy world is just fundamentally different from any other type of occupation. So it was a good lesson to learn in the most painless and harmless way early on, and something that I'm going to try to bring to everything that I think and do while I'm on the commission.
Exactly. I think the knowing you have the power to move markets is humbling and something, of course, most of us don't have and presumably don't wish to have. So it does force you to think about the responsibility that you have in a different way. So we do have a question posed by an attendee that I think is a good one, and I'll pose it to you, and then if we get any others in the next couple minutes, then we may do another one or two. So the question is, what more can or should the FCC do to protect U.S. communication systems from foreign subversion? And I understand, of course, you haven't been in your position, and we all understand that you haven't been in it for a long time. So certainly taking that into account. But how would you respond to that question, just based on your thoughts at this point?
Well, thank you, Randy. I think that that's a pretty deep question, actually, and I'd like to explore the contours of it a little bit. I'm not going to fight the hypothesis, but it's worth thinking deeply about the question's framing, implications, larger meaning. So, when we speak of foreign subversion, we could be speaking, for example, of foreign interference with American signals technology. Obviously, that was a significant focus of the telecommunications policy of the prior administration, and seems poised to continue with the present administration. But of course, purely domestic interventions in security of signals technology are seriously vitiated if our overseas allies do not feel constrained to abide by them. And so in order to secure American networks and to secure American signals, we have to have buy-in from really a world infrastructure of people who are largely allied with us, share our goals, share our understandings and concerns. And so that's as much a diplomatic effort as it is a scientific effort. Limiting the focus to science and engineering in particular, and to the FCC's role, because of course the FCC is predominantly concerned with domestic matters. It's well understood at this point that telecommunications systems can be too sophisticated to be audited with total certainty. So, for example, some tests have shown that interference with just a few transistors on a processor can render the entire processor hackable and subvertible, and that this can be done in a relatively straightforward fashion at the factory. So in a sense, to protect American signals, we would need to onshore production, and yet that's a dauntingly difficult task in an age when many of the most significant producers are overseas. What's more, actions in this respect, even if we could guarantee success in accomplishing them, might not be taken kindly by many of our longtime friends and allies who are simply trying to develop their domestic industries, nor would they avoid looking heavy-handed overseas. So, in terms of signal security, I think the best thing to do is at the FCC level is, first of all, to carry out mandates from Congress that are already in existence on this front. Second, to continue being very thoughtful about the FCC's interactions with other agencies that are predominantly responsible in this area, and third, to use our authority to enable, whether with carrots or sticks, continued development of American signals technology domestically, to proceed without being overly burdensome. But then this turns to the question of subversion in some sense other than signals intelligence. And there, again, we get into a very fraught question, because we live in an international media ecosystem right now, and it would seem, I think, very, very high-handed and contrary to principles of American freedom to make, for example, a blanket across-the-board prohibition of at least facially innocent media activities by foreign entities. we have to, we have to make sure not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In any sort of action regarding foreign media influence, of course, unlawful foreign media influence is already something that Congress has attempted to address in ways that, again, I think lie primarily outside of FCC responsibilities. To the extent that domestic enforcement actions are fully applicable to some sort of misuse of the airwaves or of other means of transmission within the United States, then the FCC can look at it. But otherwise, really, our mandate is to work with the interagency process, lending support at key places where necessary. But it's really a whole government response.
Wow, that was a full response, and we appreciate that. I want to ask you this question because you just actually referred to interagency process in a slightly different context, but I think you've got a unique vantage point, at least to maybe shed some insight on this question. Over the past couple of years, as you well know, there have been particular instances where there have been differences of opinion between the executive branch, on the one hand, as represented by NTIA, and the FCC, on the other hand, Commissioner Simington, regarding particular spectrum matters and frequencies, and we've have a couple of those that we're all familiar with. And earlier, you referred in your remarks to already, I think, appreciating the expertise of the staff at the FCC Commission, and I certainly don't always agree with things that come out of the commission, and that's certainly true. But I've always respected the commission staff since I served at the commission. And my question is this: give us, so there's now focus on the whether there are ways to improve the coordination process between the FCC and the administration regarding spectrum to perhaps avoid some of the types of difficulties that have been experienced, say with Legato and others. You were at NTIA, of course, and now you're a commissioner. What do you have thoughts about improving that process in a way that ultimately is of benefit to the consumers in this country and the other interests that are affected?
Well, thank you, Randy. That's a great topic. I'd be glad to delve into that. And just I might add parenthetically that representing consumer interests also would, for example, and just to give both sides their due, would include representing public safety interests or national defense interests or other interests of a type that's typically vindicated through the executive branch. So again, it's just to shine a little bit of light on the complexity of what it means to protect consumers. So as to the question of coordination between NTIA and FCC, narrowly construed as coordination between the two agencies, I think things are rather positive on that front. As you know, there's work underway to revise the memorandum of understanding between the two agencies, with the original version and the version still in effect dating from, I believe, 2003. So of course I support that effort, and I'm very hopeful that we'll get to a good consensus on that and proceed to a better basis for interagency cooperation. But I don't think that really resolves the question, because of course the NTIA is the agency that within the executive branch that directly liaises with the FCC on various matters in its capacity as the agency regulating federal spectrum. But that's not to say that federal spectrum interests only reside at the NTIA. And I think that's a point of difficulty that while I'm working on it, I don't think we can expect overnight success. I think this is going to be a lengthier process of revision. So just to give examples, there are aspects of federal frequency that impugn or implicate DOT interests, or others that implicate DOD interests. And as such, by the time an issue gets to the NTIA with its obviously expert engineering and technical staff and legal staff and others, that issue may already have been extensively developed within another agency. And so the NTIA has the difficulty of needing to defend and promote a point of view that, while it may not disagree with it, was not developed internally and and comes from a constituency that the NTIA does not control. So I don't think the NTIA is really doing anything wrong in its communications with the FCC, and obviously vice versa. But rather, I think the FCC has got to continue developing deeper relationships and stronger communication with other executive branch agencies whose spectrum interests might be implicated. And that way, I think both the FCC and the NTIA will have a happier time of it going forward, and we'll be able to shorten the problem disclosure response and compromise steps, so that there are fewer overt confrontations.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just do one more question, then we'll let you go. We don't want to impose on your time, so this will be the last one. And again, I should say, with all of these questions, I'm very impressed with the depth and the substance of your answers. I think some of these, like the one I'm about to pose, are at a stage where it's quite possible you may not have, of course, formed any definitive opinion at this point, but they're useful to people. Are always interested in anything that has to do with net neutrality. So I'm going to pose this as the last question, Commissioner. You raised some concerns about the consequences of a Title II net neutrality policy, and I should just say, but in the interest of disclosures, we say here in Washington, because most people know this on the call, I have long expressed those concerns myself, but this is for you. But you also said that you're open to discussion and seem to concede in the questioner's own language that supporters of Title II net neutrality have some legitimate concerns. Is there a form of Title II net neutrality policy you could vote for?
Well, thanks very much. And again, that's I think a thoughtful question, and I'll try and give it a thoughtful answer. So I think there's sometimes a public perception that that the commission is controlled just by its majority. I don't think that that's necessarily true. The vast majority of decisions are bipartisan. Of course, the news doesn't tend to report the dog bites man. The news tends to report man bites dog, and controversy is always more of a social focus than harmony and cooperation. But a great deal of harmony and cooperation and bipartisanship characterize the entire history of the FCC and certainly its recent history as well. Now, in terms of what kind of Title II policy is supportable, my view is that commission decisions, even ones that ultimately do not command a consensus, are nonetheless formed organically by conversations, discussions, analysis, etc., internally within the commission. So, for example, if I were to see a proposal come up on Title II after reviewing it on the merits, the next thing that I would do would be to take my analysis on the merits to other commissioners and ask their views on the analysis, on the conclusions. And my suspicion is that regardless of how the voting shakes out in the end, that discussion shapes how the final item manifests. And so whether you're in minority, whether you're in majority, or whether it's unanimous, there's always going to be a lot of contribution from all parties. So the short answer for the question then of whether there's a form of Title II net neutrality policy that I could vote for, let's just imagine, just as a thought experiment, let's imagine a Title II net neutrality that uses the forbearance powers in a way that all legal authorities come to agree, and I realize I'm stipulating a lot here, but just bear with me, that all legal authorities agree to be fully legitimate, and this Title II item says formally Title II net neutrality is imposed. and all the provisions of Title II are forborne from. Obviously, I could support that. That's no different from Title I. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. How long does these forbearances last? Is this the nose in the camel's tent? And is such an item ever likely to exist? And, of course, the answer is no. For any item that comes before the commission, every commissioner has a duty to the public interest to thoroughly examine it on the merits. I am not bringing an unchangeably closed mind to the commission on any topic, and certainly not on the highly fraught topic of net neutrality. And I would also note that that net neutrality is a slogan that's been around since about 2003. And it's changed its meaning many times. The economic circumstances undergirding it have changed many times. The view of industry has changed of net neutrality many times. And as for a final item, it's just very difficult to say. All I can promise is that anything that comes across will get a thorough review on the merits. I'll consult in depth with anyone who wants to talk to me, whether that's industry, whether that's society groups, whether that's legislators, or just members of the general public, or any other constituency. And as we all expect that there most likely will be a Title II item brought this year, these aren't theoretical commitments that are lightly given. Instead, this is something I expect to have to very deeply engage in, and whether something comes through in the end that can ultimately earn my vote, entirely possible, and I hope it does.
Commissioner Simington, I want to thank you so much for really the thoughtfulness of your answers. Of course, also for your formal address, but also I thought that the exchange that we've had and been able to engage in was really thoughtful, and to be really candid with you and our attendees was much more substantive even than I anticipated for someone who has been in the position for as briefly as you've been in your position. I assume you can only do a maiden address one time by definition. So again, I'm grateful we were able to do that at the Free State Foundation. But I can assure you, without any doubt, that we hope to have you back in the future at other Free State Foundation events many times. Again, just by the nature of our calendar, that may be as soon as later in March. But I know that having been able to listen and absorb your remarks today, that only whetted the appetite of many of us to hear more as you continue to serve in your term as commissioner. So with that, I'm going to thank you again and thank all of our panelists who attended today. I will also tell others that I think C-SPAN intends to rebroadcast this event. So I'm pleased that we got the video working as well. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you, and we look forward to seeing everyone again at the next Free State Foundation event, probably in March. Goodbye to all.
Thank you, Randy. It's been a delight, and I've greatly appreciated our time today and looking forward to talking again soon. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.